Tonight on Nova. For a stranger in a foreign land, language can be an imposing barrier. But there are surprising similarities among the languages of the world. Could it be that at one time, long ago, we all spoke the same language?
It's very nice to think about the days before Babel, when everybody spoke exactly the same way.
Tantalizing new clues are challenging scientists in search of the first language.
Funding for NOVA is provided by
Merck, dedicated to pharmaceutical research, committed to discovery, improving health, extending life. Merck.
and Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. There are more than 5,000 languages spoken across the face of the earth. Could all these languages ever be traced back to a common starting point? Was there a time when the people of the world spoke one tongue? This notion is vividly brought to life in the Old Testament story of Babel. It harkens back to a primeval time when the people of the earth were all of one language and of one speech. According to biblical legend, the people of Babylon started to build a tower reaching up to heaven. Their ambition so offended God that he shattered the unity of their language, creating a confusion of incomprehensible tongues. Forever after, the tower was called Babel, from the Hebrew word balbail, meaning to confuse. This legend has inspired countless works of art, differing interpretations of that cataclysmic event. Like many myths, perhaps there is a germ of truth in the Babel story. Did a mother tongue ever exist? Can we find it? Clues can be found by studying the world's great language families, such as Indo-European, the family that includes English.
The branches of this tree can represent different language families. The leaves on the branches, if we had leaves today, would represent different languages. And by tracing these branches back, one can arrive at larger branches, such as Indo-European. And by tracing the Indo-European branch back, one arrives at even larger branches. Eventually, we believe that you arrive at the main trunk of this tree, into which all of the language, or from which all of the language families have derived.
There are some obvious connections among languages. Take Arabic and Hebrew, for example. Listen to how people count in each language. That was Arabic. Here's the Hebrew. Some numbers sound almost identical. But with other languages, it's not always so easy to spot the connections.
यूं तो टर्की से लेकर हिंदुस्तान तक कहने को सब अपने मुल्क समझे जाते हैं, लेकिन कोई इंसान
Radio Sunrise serves an ethnically diverse West London community, including Punjabi speakers living in the midst of an English suburb. What could these two languages, Punjabi and English, have in common?
But never meets Sridevi's daughter. And guess what? Her daughter has fallen in love with who? Yes.
In fact, English and Punjabi, as well as other languages of northern India, like Hindi and Gujarati, are related. Something discovered by chance 200 years ago by a multilingual English lawyer, Sir William Jones.
He was a judge who went out to India in 1783, but he studied languages, Oriental languages, before he went. And when he got to India, he became very interested and learnt Sanskrit, which is the language of ancient India, which was first written about 500 AD. And then he realized, he made this great discovery, that Sanskrit resembles in some way, has relationships with Greek and Latin and other languages. And he gave a very famous discourse in which he said that these were sprung from some common source.
Certain similarities are striking. Take the numbers again, for example. Here are 2, 3, 7, and 10 in English, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. The 3s are alike in all the languages. But linguists are interested in discovering regular patterns, not isolated resemblances. So here T in English often appears as D in the other languages, and H in Greek appears as S in English, Latin, and Sanskrit. By finding patterns like these, different languages can be grouped together as members of a language family.
The question is, how can you tell that the languages you're looking at reflect a single original language and therefore form a family? The only way you can do that is by finding systematic similarities between these languages in every area of their grammar, similarities in their sounds, similarities in their inflections, similarities in the syntax of the language, and so forth. And the similarities have to be very precise, and they have to be interlocking for the assertion that these languages form a family to be believable. You take a look at an English word like tooth and see that in Hindi it's dant, and by itself that doesn't mean very much. But you take a look at English 10, and it shows up in Hindi as das, and you see the same pattern emerging. You've got an initial T in English and an initial D in Hindi. When you find that the word tu, the numeral, in English shows up in Hindi as do, and you've got, once again, an initial T in English and an initial D in Hindi, you begin to think that perhaps this is not an accident.
Using this comparative method, linguists have been able to establish the connections among a group of languages which stretch from Iceland to India. This group of about 100 languages is called the Indo-European family of languages. Each of these languages can be traced to one of 10 individual branches, represented here by distinct colors. The lines which do not extend all the way are the languages which have gone extinct. The subgroups, or daughter families, that survive today are Balto-Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, Italic, also Albanian, Hellenic, Armenian, and finally Indo-Iranian. By looking closely at the Germanic family, we can see how it has evolved over time into different languages until we reach the ones we recognize today, such as Swedish, Danish, English, and Dutch. By studying all the languages in this wide-ranging group, linguists have been able to reconstruct a hypothetical ancestral tongue called Proto-Indo-European, believed to have been spoken 5,000 to 6,000 years ago.
What historical linguists do, the task they set themselves, is to look at the current stage of a language, try and find other languages that are related to it, that descend from the same ancestor, and by this active comparison, try and trace back through time what earlier stages of the language might have been like, what the words used to mean, how the words used to be pronounced, how words used to be put together in sentences. And this is a very fascinating endeavor because languages can change in very unpredictable ways. And what linguists love to do is to look beneath the surface diversity and find the ultimate proto-unity that the languages had before they split off from each other.
But recognizing this ultimate proto-unity is not easy. Take an example from English. Here is the Lord's Prayer as it would have sounded spoken in Old English 1,200 years ago.
Fader urer, du art in heaven, sia je halgat nomadin, to kimeth reach din, se willo din swaes in heaven on din earth. Plaf usener ofurwislich selus today, and for Jefus schulde usra, swave for Jefon schuldum usurn.
Now listen to Middle English, spoken 800 years ago. It's more intelligible but still not familiar.
Our Father, that art in heavenes, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come to be. Be thy will done in earth as it is done in heaven. Give it to us today our each day's bread, and forgive to us our sins.
Over the course of 1,200 years, English has changed so dramatically that Old English sounds to us like a foreign language. But English is relatively easy for linguists to study because of its long written history. This phenomenon is true for many of the Indo-European languages, making this the most studied and well-researched language family in the world. The 100 languages that comprise the Indo-European family are spoken by half the world's people. Another important language family is Sino-Tibetan, spoken by 1/4 of the world's population. Linguists estimate this family includes about 250 to 300 languages. Apart from Chinese, Tibetan, and Burmese, the majority of languages in this family were not written down until this century. At the University of California, Berkeley, James Matisoff and his students have spent the last 8 years figuring out which languages belong to this family by mapping out the details of their relationships. Their goal is to produce the definitive historical thesaurus of the Sino-Tibetan language family.
This is one of the great language families of the world, over 1 billion speakers, and it's very much understudied compared to other language families like Indo-European or Semitic or Bantu. So it's long overdue that this family receive the attention it deserves from the linguistic world in general. And it's called a thesaurus because the organizational principle is by semantic field, not just by alphabetical order. So the first field we're dealing with is body parts. We've been working on them for several years. After that, we'll do animal names, kinship terms, verbs of motion, other areas of the vocabulary by their meaning, not just by their sound. How do we collect this data? Well, first of all, we use published sources, dictionaries, as many dictionaries as we can get our hands on one or another language in the family. And we go through them to extract the body part terms. So somebody has to go through manually and check all the words which have to do with parts of the body, and then we input them into the computer and get them ready for etymological analysis. And then comes the really hard part and the interesting part, and that is to sort out these forms according to how they're related to each other.
As they discover common roots in a wide range of languages, patterns of sound and meaning start to emerge.
Okay, why don't we call up the words for I from the database?
All right, that's pretty straightforward.
Okay, you see we have hundreds and hundreds of forms meaning I in the various Sino-Tibetan languages. And now is the time to try and analyze them, do something with them. We notice lots of these words have the shape M-I-K or something similar, sometimes S-M-I-K or M-Y-A-K. So one of the next steps is to put them all in one place and examine them together. So why don't we call up all of the words which have the shape Mik. All right, and we see we have several screens full of words with that shape. So this is good evidence that we're dealing here with a genuine root in the proto-language, because the great variety of the languages and the fact that they're not spoken in geographically contiguous areas means that we have to reject borrowing as a possibility. And we notice that a lot of these forms are not just monosyllables. They have 2 or 3 syllables. And we notice they have meanings which involve I, but which mean more than I, like eyelid, eyelash, eyebrow, eye crud that gets stuck in the corners of the eye at night. To be jealous, as we say in English, to be green-eyed, except there's another metaphor in Tibeto-Burman. So we feel responsible for giving an explanation, an etymology for every single syllable of every word, if we can. And if we can't do it, then we mark it with a symbol which means we can't do it yet, but we'll get back to it sometime.
By finding the same root in different groups of languages, Matisoff begins to identify patterns of relationships among the Sino-Tibetan family. Occasionally, there's a language that doesn't quite fit. For example, the language of Thailand. There are hundreds of Thai words that are identical to Chinese. Thai has often been classified in the Sino-Tibetan family. But by comparing roots, Matisoff demonstrated more compelling similarities between Thai and a neighboring family called Austronesian. For example, I in Thai is Ta, not Mik. Likewise, the root for I in Austronesian is Mata. Perhaps the similarities that Thai shares with Chinese are due to borrowing, not descent from a common ancestor. This distinction is critical.
The further back in time you go, it becomes very difficult to distinguish between inheritance from the common ancestor and borrowing from another group, especially in a family where there are few historical records and where the written histories don't go back very far. Also, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish descent from a common ancestor or borrowing from sheer chance, accident. And any two languages taken at random in the world will show a certain percentage of apparent similarities, even in basic vocabulary. That's because there's only a limited number of sounds in human languages, and there are certain built-in constraints on the form of human language, which makes accidental resemblance quite possible and frequent, in fact.
So understanding why words are similar is essential to determining relationships among families. Although the exact number of language families has yet to be determined, most linguists recognize at least 200. Some of the principal ones, in addition to Indo-European, Sino-Tibetan, and Austronesian, are Afro-Asiatic, Altaic, Dravidian, and Australian Aboriginal. One area of the world where the language picture is particularly complex is the Americas. With so many native languages facing extinction, linguists have been more involved with recording these languages than classifying them. Here, along the ancient shores of Flathead Lake in northwestern Montana, Salish speakers from the Flathead Indian Reservation are trying to prevent their language from disappearing. These are some of the last fluent speakers of Salish, a language known to have been spoken in this region for thousands of years.
Salish is one of the languages that's targeted not to survive. And that's frightening to me because we carry our culture, we carry our tradition, we carry our history, the very history of who we are through our language. And that's what it is we're doing here at Language Camp. We're trying to put our language in context, in cultural context, to create a new generation of fluent Salish speakers.
Today on the Flathead Reservation, there are approximately 6,300 tribal members, yet fewer than 100 are fluent Salish speakers. Unfortunately, of the remaining speakers, the vast majority are elders. Historically, Salishan was one of the most extensive language families of the Northwest. Linguists believe there were no fewer than 23 distinct languages in the family. By the 18th century, at least 100,000 speakers spread over 22 million acres, from southern British Columbia to western Montana. Then Salish speakers had their first encounter with whites, a friendly meeting with Lewis and Clark in 1805. Gradually, Native American communities came under the influence of the settlers and missionaries that soon followed. The Jesuits were the first black robes to live among the Salish. Initially, they were welcomed. Adults went to church, and children went to their boarding schools. But tensions mounted as priests demanded that the Salish children speak English, forbidding them to use their native tongue. It took only 100 years for a language which had thrived for millennia to be on the verge of extinction. Today, support for the tribe's effort to renew the language and preserve its cultural traditions is growing among the members. On a mountainside deep in the forest, Chauncey Beaverhead harvests cedar bark in the same careful way his grandfather and great-grandfather did 100 years ago. Back at the campground, parents look on as their children painstakingly try to master the handicrafts that were once essential survival skills for their ancestors.
You're down that way. Look myself. Go
on! You don't hit her right in the head, okay? See how I'm wiggling it up now?
But as the children concentrate on making their baskets surrounded by sounds of English and Salish, another very important project is taking place. The tribe has invited linguist Sarah Thomason to work with them on a written record of their language and customs.
When I first started working on Salish and languages, reading about them, my main interest was historical. I'm a historical linguist. I wanted to find out about the borrowing situation in this part of the country and neighboring parts of Canada. But when I started working with the tribal members, with elders on the reservation, I found that what they wanted and needed was somebody who could help them with their preservation efforts. All right. Le es chalpu lechwi, and that means
it's getting daylight, early daylight.
Could you say it once more, please?
Without a fairly complete written record, the death of the last native Salish speaker would mean the permanent loss of the language. Thomason has been working with this group of elders to create a Salish-English dictionary, as well as to preserve descriptions of traditional life for future generations.
They get themselves decked out.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Like for the war dance.
Right. Decked.
Okay, so let's go over it and see how many mistakes I've made so you can correct me so I don't get it wrong. Le wisen kaka, they finished the canvas dance. Le eschelpu lechwi, it's getting light.
Nearly half of the tribal languages known to be part of the Salishan family are already extinct. Salish has thus far been spared. The loss of so many languages is an obstacle to understanding the full richness of the linguistic history of the Americas. Of the 1,600 languages once spoken here, only a third exist today. It's estimated that these languages, both living and extinct, might include as many as 200 language families. But despite this scant amount of evidence, there is no lack of determination to draw a complete picture of the languages of the Americas. At Stanford University, one linguist who has been intrigued with the language puzzle of the Americas for many years is Joseph Greenberg.
What keeps me going is the curiosity about the whole thing, and I'm attracted, as a matter of fact, to areas of the world in which classification has not yet been accomplished to people's satisfaction. There are always new etymologies to be discovered. And in doing that, it's very much like detective work.
Many years ago, Greenberg received worldwide acclaim when he applied his detective skills to classifying the 1,000 languages of Africa. Although the African languages had been recorded for centuries, very little systematic study had been undertaken.
In Africa, it was obvious that there were, first of all, a very large number of languages, a great many unresolved questions, and it seemed to me that the sensible thing was to actually look at all of the languages. I usually had preliminary notebooks in which I took those elements of language which, on the whole, we know are the most stable over time. These are things like the personal pronouns, particularly the first and second person, names for the parts of the human body and words for important objects in nature that are part of everyday life, like fire, water, house, and so on. I would look at a very large number of languages in regard to these matters, and I did find that they fell into quite obvious groupings.
Linguists had already postulated 3 language families: Afro-Asiatic, Niger-Congo, and Khoisan. Greenberg's analysis revealed a 4th, Nilo-Saharan, which had been considered part of Niger-Congo. This new family suggested a fundamental connection between languages that appeared extremely different. For some, the reclassification provided important insights about African migrations.
Linguistic classifications tell you about history. Each language family represents one historical event. Once you have an overall classification, then you can make certain historical inferences from that classification. This is exactly what Greenberg did in Africa, where he showed that the very widespread Bantu group in southern Africa was most closely related to languages that weren't Bantu, but which were almost Bantu, semi-Bantu, found in Nigeria. And from this classification, he hypothesized that the Bantu family had spread from the area of eastern Nigeria throughout all of what is now southern Africa. So this historical inference was made once he understood what the proper classification was of these languages.
Encouraged by his new picture of the relationships among the language families of Africa, Greenberg spent the next 30 years trying to solve the complicated language puzzle presented by the Americas.
Nobody had premised more than anything other than a very large number of groups. There were no widespread groupings. So I began to take the common words, write them down, so on, and look at them. And eventually I put them into notebooks, and the notebooks are like the ones I have here, in which you have the names of languages down one side and down the other. One can get 80 languages in a notebook like this. And across I have various words in English for which we find translations in the American Indian languages. So, for example, on this page, after having finished putting the numerals in, I have the pronouns, so I have I and thou, the second person singular pronoun. But the notebook is actually fairly extensive and contains hundreds of words in a very large number of languages.
Taking a word like blood, Greenberg wrote down its translation in language after language. When he discovered a clump of similar words in different languages, he tried to confirm the link by looking at other words in those languages. The results led Greenberg to a radical reinterpretation of the language families of the Americas. Instead of hundreds, he posited only 3 families: Eskimo-Aleut, Nodene, and the most notable, Amarant, a new superfamily which drew in languages spoken from the Hudson Bay to Tierra del Fuego. Greenberg's new classification and his methodology met with strong scientific criticism.
Eyeballing data is pre-scientific or non-scientific. There are so many ways you can be led astray, because very often words look as if they have some connection, and they have no historical connection whatsoever. It's just chance. And on the contrary, words which you might never have thought have any connection do in fact come from the same root. So even in languages which we know well, like our own native language, our judgments, unless we've just looked something up, are liable to be absolutely wrong. Our judgments on whether things are related or not. How much the more so when we're dealing with languages we have no academic or personal knowledge of, and which have been badly recorded for the most part, and when we're trying to reestablish relationships which go back untold thousands of years. The potential for error is enormous unless you have some methodological constraints to guide you every step of the way.
But sometimes, regardless of approach, historical linguistics is faced with an unsolvable puzzle. There is one language in Europe which has baffled scholars for centuries. Sarrak looks like a typical French village. But its graveyard holds a linguistic secret. Inscribed alongside the French is the mysterious language of the Basque people. The language is called Iascara, and it has resisted any classification so far. It is called a language isolate, an orphan among languages with no known relatives. The land of the Basques straddles the borders of France and Spain. No amount of analysis has been able to link Iascara to French, Spanish, or to any European language, nor in fact to a language anywhere in the world. How could this linguistic isolation have come about? Perhaps it was the fierce independence of the Basque people, their resistance to outside invaders, and their strong history of oral tradition. But whatever the reason, the Basque language has withstood centuries of influence. Scientists have wondered whether a biological comparison between the Basques and their Indo-European speaking neighbors would reflect that isolation as well.
What we ordinarily do in biology is really bilateral comparisons, but we do them all the possible ones. And
geneticist Cavalli Sforza of Stanford University was a pioneer in the search for notable biological indicators.
They must realize that there is a degree of relationship, and that it's very important to take that into account, otherwise you cannot do anything.
Cavalli Sforza was interested in exploring historical relationships among different populations by examining their genes rather than their languages. Would his research team find the Basques as unique as the linguists found them? If the Basques are as isolated as their language suggests, this isolation might also show up in their genetic makeup, blood groups, DNA patterns, and so on. New techniques now make it possible to carry out much more detailed analyses of individuals and populations using just a few living cells, in this case, cells from a hair follicle. The DNA pattern not only distinguishes the Basque from their neighbors, it suggests they must have been among the earliest people to settle in Europe.
Basques were recognized as genetically different a long time ago. Basques are so different that they must have been Proto-Europeans. Basques were probably the descendants of cultures that have made all those beautiful rock paintings in the southwest of France and in the north of Spain.
These cave paintings, many of them located in Basque country, were painted 15,000 years ago. Since the genetic data suggests the Basques have been a distinct group for thousands of years, isolated from other peoples, it may have been their ancestors who painted these caves during the last ice age. Although this conclusion is speculative, Cavalli Sforza is trying to use these techniques to solve other linguistic puzzles, including Greenberg's controversial classification of Native American languages. DNA samples from many different tribes in North and South America were collected and analyzed in Cavalli Sforza's lab at Stanford. He believes his results provide a strong confirmation of Greenberg's groupings.
When we took all the data from American natives, they clearly fell into three classes, and they correspond exactly to linguistic families that have been postulated by Greenberg. Not only that, but the family which is most heterogeneous of all, genetically, is the one that is linguistically more heterogeneous of all.
Even if it's true, let's accept for the sake of argument for a while, that the New World was settled by exactly three waves of immigrants, the Amerinds and the Na-Dene and the Eskimo Aleuts. Let's even assume that's true. What is there to show that they were linguistically uniform when they migrated? Or that they didn't change their language dozens of times, that the language wasn't creolized, that they didn't abandon their language and adopt a new one? We can see that people can change their language within a generation. It happens all over the world. And suppose some future linguist 10,000 years from now was looking at the DNA from United States fossils. He would be very confused indeed, because he would find all kinds of racial genetic strains, which wouldn't tell him anything about the fundamental linguistic unity of this country, that we all speak English now.
One good example of language change occurring in less than a generation can be seen in Philadelphia. Here, a team of linguists has carried out field work over the last 20 years to see at what rate English words change and why.
When I first came into this field, I was interested in finding out how language was changing as it was used in everyday life, and these tapes that you see here are part of the archives of this room going back to 1963, when I did a little study in Martha's Vineyard, because I noticed on that island that people were saying sight and fight and right, going back to what seemed like a 17th, 18th century pronunciation. Philadelphia, we chose as a community where almost all the vowels were changing, and I came here to try to find out, if I could, why language was changing. The 19th century theories about it would argue that it was either the people at the bottom of the heap were changing it because of laziness and ignorance, or the people at the top because they had such prestige. But we'd found out that the opposite was true, that the sound changes were in the hands of the people who were the most important local people.
And people put down their lights already, haven't they? After the 6th, it's a little Christmas.
Ann Bauer is one of the field workers who began this study with me in the 1970s.
It's their job since they took the Christmas lights down.
Celeste Sweeney is one of her most important contacts, a center of a social network here in South Philadelphia. In every neighborhood, you need to know the people who are the central figures, so that you can understand how society works and who influences who.
She's probably having a fit, right?
Ann Bauer and Celeste Sweeney have become close friends over the years. They talk with each other in a relaxed and informal way.
Your mom made abelend. How did she do that? How did she make that?
Well, then when she would make sauce, gravy, we call it gravy, you call it sauce, and she would put gravy on top and then the sausages. And then, like some people, they used to eat it on a big board.
In the last 50 years, there have been massive changes in American English.
Believe me, we ate properly.
In the history of English, the vowels have always been the ones that move, and the consonants have stayed put. And over the course of time, small changes add up into great changes.
Your dad wasn't working during the Depression?
No, not at all. He worked for Guiding Shoe Store. My father used to make shoes. He was a shoemaker. He made the whole shoe. And it got so bad that they were paying him in postage stamps.
We're taking the word bad to bad, the word out to out. We notice that go moves to go. We notice that two goes from two to two. In the meantime, sight and fight are becoming sight and fight, or sight and fight. There are other changes that are just beginning to appear, where A, as in made and pain, becomes mead and pain, so that snake and sneak can sound the same. So we have a rotation of the whole vowel system, which is happening in different ways in different cities in the United States and in England too.
By measuring changes in Celeste's speech patterns for over a decade and comparing her results to those of other Philadelphians, Labov has been able to observe language change in action. But how important are these apparently small changes in pronunciation to the overall history of languages?
Whatever the forces that are producing this change, they must be very powerful, because they really do interfere with understanding. Our current research is dealing with cross-dialectal comprehension, and we've taken 3 cities, Chicago, Birmingham, and Philadelphia, which are becoming more and more different. And we find, indeed, that people do not understand the sounds in the dialects of other cities. And even within the city, the older people don't understand the younger people when it comes to using those sounds. So that's the process which several hundred or several thousand years ago led to a gradual differentiation of languages and the loss of intelligibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen in the United States, because there are other factors at work there too, but we can trace that day-to-day change, which ultimately leads to 2 different languages.
If English shows significant change within a single decade, the implications for linguists who are trying to study a language believed to have been spoken 15,000 years ago are enormous. Yet an effort is underway to do exactly that. One of the leaders of a controversial group of linguists who believe in the Nostratic theory is Vitaly Sheveroshkin. This theory claims to identify an ancient superfamily of languages from which many of today's language families have descended. It wasn't until the 1960s in Russia that the Nostratic theory was approached with modern linguistic techniques by Vladislav Ilyich Svetich. He believed he could work back in time from several reconstructed languages 6,000 years old to find a more remote common ancestor, a language he called Proto-Nostratic. Today, Vitaly Sheveroshkin, an original member of this Russian group, is convinced of the importance of his mentor's work.
He could see and find in the chaos exactly things which fit. And that is the most important thing in linguistics, because there are so many data. And he managed to establish precise sound correspondences between these Nostratic words in different languages, and make other things like reconstruct grammar and semantics and lexics and so on. So it was something which was done in a very precise way, and that's why it is so great, I think.
The search for an ancestor language begins with modern-day words. Comparing water in English, Russian, and other related languages suggests a common ancestor. 6,000 years ago, water was probably wood. The Russian group goes farther. They start with several of these reconstructed languages. For example, comparing 6,000-year-old words for water, the Russians argue for the ancestral word wete, which they believe belonged to a language spoken about 10 to 15,000 years ago.
If there really were a Nostratic language family, which would embrace a whole series, it would include Indo-European, it would include the Semitic languages, in fact the larger Afro-Asiatic family, including the languages of North Africa, it would include the Altaic languages and so on. It would be a vast area which would be populated by people speaking languages descended from Proto-Nostratic. If one follows the divergence hypothesis, that one can trace them back through time to a common origin, it would mean that somewhere there would be an area where Proto-Nostratic was spoken at a particular time, perhaps 10,000 years ago or a little more.
Another Russian Nostraticist working today is Aaron Dolgopolsky. Here, in the midst of one of the oddest collections of dictionaries and grammars in the world, he is trying to recreate a complete grammar, syntax, and vocabulary for the Proto-Nostratic language. He starts with words he believes are more resistant to change over time.
Linguists know that what is called the kernel vocabulary is usually stable. For instance, the word for water, as you know, in English is just the same as in German and as in Russian. So we know that in which meanings we can expect to find a word which has been preserved for thousands of years. Well, it includes body parts, words for water and to eat, to be, man, etc.
Using this method, Dolgopolsky argues he has reconstructed over 1,000 Proto-Nostratic words. They vividly evoke for him the rhythm of a life lived 15,000 years ago.
Through the telescope of the vocabulary, we can discern a hunter who is following Dasa. The tracks, Goki, Gudya, Miryo, of a beast, Guira, is casting a spear, Korvu, Shubya, and is trying to hit Tapa, the target, and is afraid of missing it. Among the animals, he hunts hakra or harka. There are different kinds of antelopes, oryu, gula, gurha, etc. He knows a lot about the anatomy of animals. Meat, homsha, siulya, marrow, aingo, spleen, lepa, palge. Some words are connected with spiritual culture, such as though meaning to make magic, to use magical forces, arba.
This picture that Dolgopolsky paints of the proto-Nostratic world is controversial and not widely accepted. In fact, most linguists argue that any attempt to come up with a language spoken 15,000 years ago is pure speculation. At the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Donald Ringe takes issue with the Nostratic approach.
As far as I can tell, the observed rate of basic vocabulary loss in languages imposes a limit of about 10 or 12,000 years. That would be about as far back as we can reconstruct proto-languages using scientific methods. And it should come as no surprise that all the generally recognized language families, Indo-European, Algonquian, Afro-Asiatic, Uralic, that sort of thing, began to diverge and diversify within that window of the past 10,000 years.
For Ringe, the problem is this. As an ancient language gets passed on from generation to generation, the population shifts. People move away, mix with others, or divide into different groups. Changes in the language accumulate. New sounds and new words appear until after 10,000 years there is no way to be sure that any of the original words are left. But Nostraticists argue that there are core words like pronouns which resist change, and it's these specific words they look for in each language family. For Ringe, even if particular words are alike in a variety of language families today, the similarity is not proof that they have survived from some ancestral language.
When you have most of the original words lost and only a few remaining, you really can't tell the difference between resemblances which are real and reflect a common source from which the languages derive, and the resemblances that are simply kicked up by chance, static, statistical noise, so to speak. There is a real limit, as we go back in time, on how much we can reconstruct.
Most linguists set a limit on language reconstruction of 10,000 years. However, fossil evidence suggests our modern human ancestry can be traced back 100,000 years. Could this fossil record shed any light on when language originally evolved?
One of the fundamental questions at the moment in anthropology is how far back do we have to go in time to find a common ancestor for the shared pattern of humans that we find all over the world. Well, here we've got a reconstruction of a skull and jaw from a specimen found in Ethiopia in 1967, a site called Omo Kibish. This specimen is probably over 100,000 years old, and my work and that of colleagues has shown that this is an anatomically modern specimen. And there's quite a bit of evidence now that points to Africa, or perhaps the Middle East, as the place which has the earliest occurrence of modern people. Modern human language must have been in existence by 40,000 years ago, because we have evidence of complex human behaviour by that time in early modern people. For example, in Europe, the Cro-Magnons had clearly complex social systems, symbolic behaviour, art, many of the things which we associate with modern humans and hunter-gatherers all over the world. And so I feel that by that time there must have been full language of a modern human type. But to go back further, it becomes more difficult to track the existence of such a complex language. I would guess that such a thing was at least in the early stages of development in these populations 100,000 years ago in Africa.
But fossil evidence gives us no help in solving the puzzle of what kind of language our earliest ancestors spoke. Still, some linguists believe it is possible to trace human language back in time even further than the Nostraticists. By looking for connections among all the language families of the world, they try to reconstruct a mother tongue possibly spoken from 40 to 100,000 years ago.
Now, using traditional methods of comparative linguistics, linguists have been able to show that there are many language families around the world. If one simply compares these language families among themselves, in other words, look at the words which have been identified by scholars in those individual families as characteristic of those families, one runs across the exact same word in family after family after family. Two of the most famous have become tik, meaning one or finger, and pal, meaning two. You find these two roots in family after family after family. And I think that there is no way to explain why you find these roots as well as many others, except to hypothesize that they all derive from one common source.
Another example Rulin offers is the word malika. Appearing in English as milk, the word form shows up around the world with meanings which are associated with milk, or suckle, or breast, or throat. For Rulin and a few other linguists, this is compelling evidence that deep in the mists of time there was one word for something like to suckle, which has survived in each of the world's language families. But to his critics, a few isolated examples do not make a convincing case.
It's quite possible. There are some very, very impressive examples. But impressive examples is one thing, but serious reconstruction, in order to make it, we must first reconstruct all kinds of languages. This is one thing. That's why I think that it is probably feasible, but just today it is probably too early.
It seems overwhelmingly likely to me that all human languages derive from some common source. I think most linguists would agree with that. I think we would all be shocked if anyone ever came up with hard evidence that all human languages don't derive from some common source. But unfortunately, that's not the issue. The issue is whether we can offer objective proof that all human languages derive from a common source, or whether we have to be content to believe it.
Even if we accept, for the sake of argument, the Nostratic theory and say that the time depth is 15,000 years, 15,000 is not 40,000, and it's not 200,000. You just cannot go back. There were glaciations in between there, too, by the way, and all kinds of catastrophes on the global scale between 200,000 years ago and now. How could anything have been left of that presumed original linguistic unity, even if it did exist? Still, it's nice to think about. It's very nice to think about the days before Babel, when everybody spoke exactly the same way. But it's a dream, it's a belief. It's not scientifically testable one way or the other.
Gazing upon these silently evocative images from the past, it's only natural to want to know more about these artists and their message. It's easy to imagine that a people who could visually symbolize their world could also speak a complex language. New clues to the past continually emerge as we compare the world's languages and trace their relationships back in time. Language is the mirror of our humanity, and only by studying its many reflections will we ever fully know ourselves. Teachers, educational institutions, and organizations can purchase this program and many other NOVA programs for $19.95 plus shipping and handling. To order a video cassette, call 1-800-255-9424. production of WGBH Boston. Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership.
And by Merck, dedicated to pharmaceutical research, committed to discovery, improving health, extending life. Merck.
Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
This is PBS.
Next time on NOVA. High above the arid desert of East Africa lies a towering mountain chain with a bizarre climate. Winter nights and summer days, these endangered animals live only here, marooned on a mountain island in a sea of clouds. Africa as you haven't seen it before. Journey to Kilimanjaro. That's next time on NOVA.
For a transcript of the NOVA program you've just seen, send $5 to this address or call 1-303-831-9000.